Okay. Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. Thanks so much for coming. What a fantastic week this is, right? I hope everybody's been taking advantage of all the neat talks and displays. So we're kind of now towards the end of the week looking forward to our future in space and where we're going to go from here. Let's see, here we go. So we've been celebrating Apollo, though. Absolutely worthy of celebrating. What a terrific program. And yet, I know this has come up in some conversations, raise your hand if you kind of wish that we would leave low Earth orbit and are maybe feeling a little bit frustrated that we haven't in almost 50 years. Yeah, okay. So I'm not the only one, so that's good. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today, and what I was asked to talk about today is this book that I co-wrote called Beyond Earth, Our Path to a New Home on the Planets, and it's about space settlement and where humans might go in the solar system to actually colonize and settle, and if that's even possible, and also what it would look like. And the book is co-written by myself and a real author. I'm a scientist, but a real author, Charles Woolforth, and he's an Alaska-based writer. And we had fun with this project because we're both kind of two different people coming at it from different perspectives. Here's me. I'm a planetary scientist, and I am a former aspiring astronaut. I'd love to go to space. I'm really keen for humans to leave low Earth orbit, and I love studying the planets. Charles, my co-author, and I should also mention that, one of the big things that I've worked on that was mentioned was the Cassini-Huygens mission. And I spent, Cassini, for those of you who don't know, orbited Saturn for 13 years. And the mission just ended a couple of years ago, and so I worked on that for, more than 13 years. And what a great experience, and how fun to learn about Saturn, its rings, and all of the moons. And that's been kind of an inspiration, actually, for this book, too. But Charles, my co-author, as I mentioned, is an Alaska-based writer. And before, we got put together to work on this book, he never gave a thought to space, really. He's kind of a skeptic by nature. He kind of doubted that people could ever live off the Earth. And plus, he's kind of a hardcore kind of skier and boater, so he'd like to stay on Earth so he can continue with those activities. But we wanted to think about in this book, we wanted to think about what will happen in the future. And we really wanted to make it realistic. We did not want to make a sci-fi book. We wanted to make it based on what we know now. And so in putting the book together, we found that making predictions about what's going to happen in the future can be very challenging. Humanity has kind of a poor record of making predictions about technology in the future. For instance, the president of TWA Airlines in 1955 was a fellow named Ralph Damon. And he actually predicted that aircraft would not catch on. But in that year, TWA held a contest asking passengers to predict what aviation would look like in 30 years, so in 1985. And so people filled out the forms in the seat back pockets and turned them in, and their guesses included things like rocket-propelled hotels, flying taxis, helicopter house trailers, whatever that might be, and also the prediction that there would be no aviation at all because the world would be inhabited only by monkeys by that point. Or that we wouldn't need airplanes at all because we would be living on other planets already by 1985 without much gravity, and we could fly without them. So we wanted to avoid those sort of problems with predictions for our book. We wanted to make this as realistic as we could. And so one of the basic assumptions that we worked with was that even if technology changes a lot in the coming years, that human nature basically won't change. Humans are pretty much going to stay the same. And so this means that there has to be a reason for having a space colony or a space settlement, especially given the high cost. And that reason could be something that we want to go get, or maybe something that we're getting away from. And as I'll talk about, and we talk about in the book, the environment, both here on Earth and in space, is an important factor. So I'm going to read a little excerpt from the book about the outcome of that TWA contest that I talked about. So 30 years later, in 1985, TWA found the entries in a vault in Kansas City, Missouri, and sorted out all the wacky predictions and gave the finalists to a trio of judges, including astronaut Pete Conrad, who had stood on the moon in 1969. And from before the jet age, the contest winner had described the current state of 1980s aviation spot on, including how aircraft would be used. Commercial aircraft, the winner wrote, will have ranges of about 5,000 miles and will cruise at about 700 miles per hour. They will be powered by bypass jets, since atomic energy probably will not be available to commercial aviation in 1985. Passenger ships will carry about 300 people on long trips, and cargo ships will haul about 200,000 pounds payload. The winner, who wrote that, was Helen L. Thomas, whom the airline found living at the same address in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that she had listed on her entry form 30 years earlier. At 80 years old, she had retired from editing research publications at MIT and had no memory of entering a contest. It took airline officials some time to convince her that they were serious and give her the $50,000 check. So what did Helen L. Thomas have that TWA president Ralph Damon and all the other contestants lacked when they looked into the future? Well, we think that she understood that about technology and the technology that existed at the time, and she thought about how market forces could push it forward incrementally. Now, 1985 was also the year that the telephone industry was deregulated. And before that time, telephones had changed little. But since then, they've changed a lot with that deregulation. So it's hard to believe that anyone would guess how telephones would turn out. And so technology doesn't always develop incrementally. The advance of space travel has been more like jetliners than phones. It's been a little more incremental. We're at some 60 years after Sputnik orbited the Earth, and we're still in low Earth orbit. And the Apollo moon landings, as we know now, have been 50-some years ago. So we want to know, will space travel ever take a leap forward like the telephone has? What would Helen L. Thomas say? So we think that she would have predicted that whatever happens will develop from what we already know how to do today. It'll be driven by economics. People will colonize space when they have a good reason to go there or to leave here. And so this gives us some solid facts to produce a scenario for the future. In our book, we alternated sections between reporting what's really happening currently and what we think could happen based on today's current results and trends. And we look at technology and where it's going, and we look at the problems on Earth and the problems that might make us want to send an ark to another planet. And we've tried to look reasonably at what's not possible as well. So again, we've really tried to be realistic. So we considered where in the solar system are we going to set up camp? And we thought about a number of characteristics of different planetary bodies. And some of the main ones are whether a body has an atmosphere, a magnetosphere, and we know a lot about the planets in our solar system thanks to NASA and the other space agencies around the world and all of the wonderful spacecraft that have been sent to these bodies. So an atmosphere and a magnetosphere are both critical for safety of astronauts on another planet. A magnetosphere is kind of like a protective bubble that surrounds a planet, like the Earth has a magnetosphere. It's driven by the magnetic field interior to the body, and it provides important radiation shielding, and so can an atmosphere. But we also consider the temperature of the body, the gravity, the landscape, how kind of nice it would be to live on these places. So we looked at Mercury. We didn't spend too much time thinking about Mercury. It has basically no atmosphere. It's got a weak magnetosphere. It does deflect some of the solar wind that encounters it. It's very hot, as we know, on Mercury, but it can get very cold, of course, because it does not have an atmosphere. Pretty low gravity, kind of a lunar-like landscape. We also thought about Venus, kind of the opposite of Mercury in terms of atmosphere. It's got a 92 bar CO2 atmosphere, so it's toxic and super high pressure. So not very good living conditions. It also has no magnetosphere, but it does have that thick atmosphere. And it's very hot there, as we know, because of the greenhouse conditions there. It's got what I would call a volcanic landscape. We don't know if it's currently volcanically active today, but we have some good clues that it could be. So we briefly considered Mercury and Venus, but not too long for our human colony. We did also consider Venus's atmosphere. So there is an altitude in Venus's atmosphere where air-filled balloons could be stable. And these have been talked about as floating cities in the Venus atmosphere. And so it's pretty cool. It's kind of a cool idea. But for our settlement that we want to kind of establish in the solar system, we kind of want to have it be as Earth-like as possible and maybe not be living inside these sort of capsules all the time. So of course we considered the moon. We're all here to celebrate the moon, right? We all love the moon. It's the only body that's been visited by humans. It does not have much of an atmosphere or a magnetosphere. So this is why the surface looks like it does. It's been pounded and pounded by micrometeoroids over the eons. It gets directly impacted by solar wind, charged particles. Solar storms directly impact the surface. Low gravity, very high temperature variation, so it's very hot during the day and very cold at night. And it's got a cratered landscape, as we all know. So we all, I think, are familiar with some of the scenarios that NASA and ESA and some of the other space agencies have considered for sending humans to the moon and living there. And this is an ESA, European Space Agency concept for habitat. And most of these that you see involve underground living spaces. And this is because the moon does not have an atmosphere or a magnetosphere to shield it from all of that damaging radiation. And so the lunar regolith, the lunar dirt, a certain depth of it will actually shield, but you then need to live underground, like in this type of scenario. So, so we didn't consider the moon too much because we didn't want to live underground. And if the humans need to leave the Earth for very long stays, underground living is not what we wanted to go for. That said, of course, it's very important to go to the moon as a stepping stone to other places in the solar system. And of course, we also considered Mars. And NASA and other space agencies and commercial outfits are talking about sending humans to Mars. It has moderate gravity, it has a thin atmosphere, probably just enough to be a pain to land a spacecraft, or maybe be a little bit helpful, but you have to consider it, but not enough to shield from radiation very much. And not much of a magnetosphere either. And here are some of the concepts that different companies and different space agencies have considered for, again, human habitats on Mars and what they would need to look like. They would need radiation shielding. They need to live underground for the most part. That bottom image there is somebody's concept for a water habitat. So the walls are made of water because water is known to be an effective shield against some types of radiation. You need to come up with the water, or you don't want to take it with you from Earth because that's a lot of water that you would need for shielding. but Mars does have water, and it's just a matter of accessing it. So we also considered places in the outer solar system. As was said, I'm a moon person. I love the Jovian satellites of Jupiter, the Galilean satellites, and so we kind of briefly considered these. Down here you've got Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. These are all really fascinating and interesting worlds. Io is the most volcanically active body in the solar system, as a matter of fact, but that kind of rules it out for a human colony. And Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto are just icy moons. Europa is actually potentially habitable. It has a subsurface ocean, so we now call it an ocean world. So potentially there's some sort of life living in that subsurface ocean, but it's probably not particularly habitable for humans. So we can keep considering other moons in the solar system, like Saturn's satellites. Here's a couple of them. Tethys. Enceladus is another ocean world that's got this active geyser-like plume spouting water into space at its south pole. Again, Enceladus might be habitable to some form of life in its subsurface ocean, but not too habitable for humans because it's a small world. It's only 500 kilometers across, no atmosphere, and it's just icy. There's another moon of Saturn called Mammoth that we didn't really consider because we don't want to go there. Okay, so finally, we considered what I would consider to be the most Earth-like place in the solar system, and probably the best destination for humans in the solar system, which is Saturn's largest moon, Titan. And here it is. It looks like a big orange ball, and I will talk more about Titan in a minute, but I'm going to come back to Earth now and talk about why people have even colonized or settled different places of Earth in the past. And so everybody knows about Plymouth Colony and Jamestown Colony, and humans in the past have gone through to really great lengths and they've undergone a lot of danger to colonize new places in the past. Why would they have done that? Certainly not for fun. They needed financial backing to go, and they needed a good reason to go. So in our kind of thinking about why do people colonize places, we looked at some of these old colonies and tried to figure out how they made it work, including Europeans coming to America. One of the places that we considered is the lost colony of Roanoke Island, which is an interesting case study where, because you can consider the challenge of sending humans across the Atlantic in the 16th century and how that might be a little bit analogous to the challenge of sending humans across space, across the solar system, to some unknown world to settle. Now, with the lost colony of Roanoke Island, these folks did not survive. They were not self-sufficient. They were waiting for supplies, and they did not come in time, and they didn't make it. So that's a lesson. Now we can think about indigenous peoples. Those settling the Arctic have had to have good reasons because it's very cold up there, and it's really difficult to survive. And so before they moved around, they had to create technology for skin boats, for instance, and warm clothing. When they built shelters, that was probably as hard as building a space habitat is going to be for us. So just imagine digging your home out of frozen ground with stone tools and making rafters out of whale bones. These are solid igloos. They're heated with stone lamps burning seal oil, and they really kept people warm with no clothes and when the temperature outside was minus 60. I like to think of this at, now we talk about going to the moon and doing ISRU, in situ space, in situ resource utilization, and these folks were doing exactly that. So why did they do it? Well, they were partially motivated by environmental change. Overcrowding or conflict may have driven them to North America from Asia. The Inupiat culture developed some 1,000 years ago because of a cooling in the climate that gave their ancestors an advantage in whale hunting. And they spread from Alaska to Greenland. So the environment is another thing that we think about that drives colonization. Even if we call it overcrowding or wealth seeking, and economics is how we often respond to the environment. Now in the American West, the real draw for colonists was minerals and the open space that hadn't been used for agriculture. And for many settlers, the drive was overcrowding in the East and a lack of economic opportunities. But colonization of the West really took hold when it had backers, financial backers, seeking benefits. In the US, the spread of the colonists westward really started happening when the federal government provided huge land grants to railroad builders. And so making colonies technologically capable requires wealth and the ability to make money. And so in our world, that means government grants and also access to profits. And so our lessons for thinking about our space settlement are that humans in space are going to need a reason to exist environmentally, a settlement will, or economically, and they're going to need major government investment. And ultimately a way to support themselves and grow without support from home. And so where would we be able to do that in the solar system? Where can we create a self-sustaining settlement? Well, Titan is a good place to do this. It has a thick atmosphere. It's mostly nitrogen with some methane. And so the surface pressure that you experience standing on Titan is about 1.5 bars, about 1.5 times what we feel here on Earth. So not too bad at all. It's about right. And that thick atmosphere, even though Titan does not have a magnetosphere, that thick atmosphere provides adequate shielding from all that damaging space radiation. And Titan also orbits Saturn, mostly within Saturn's magnetosphere. Sometimes it's out of the magnetosphere, but it's got plenty of shielding from both of those sources. And so for me, this really sets Titan apart from the other destinations in the solar system for a long-term destination for humans, because the radiation problem is really a showstopper, unless you're talking about just short-term stays. And I'll remind you that much of what we know about Titan, being the largest moon of Saturn, it comes from the Cassini spacecraft. And as I mentioned, Cassini just finished a couple years ago its mission orbiting Saturn for 13 years. It did more than 120 Titan flybys, and this is how we know a lot about this wonderful world. Cassini carried a radar and an infrared instrument to peer through this atmosphere that we can't see through with our eyes at visible wavelengths. And so now we know that Titan's surface looks something like this, where it's got variable dark and bright areas. It actually looks a little Earth-like, doesn't it? Although these are not continents. I don't want to mislead people, and we don't exactly know what the dark and bright areas are. We still have a lot to learn about Titan. This is an infrared map. It's kind of a false color. And these are more infrared pictures. These are kind of more updated, showing each of the hemispheres of Titan. Again, false color, but just showing you how variable it is across the surface, and really interesting. And this is a radar map. So we were able to map out much of the surface of Titan at radar wavelengths, again, to peer through that thick atmosphere. And I don't know, do I have a pointer? I don't think I have a pointer, but there is a red kind of X in the middle of this map that maybe you can see. And that marks the spot where the Cassini spacecraft released the Huygens Probe. And the Huygens Probe was released, and it flew through the atmosphere of Titan. This is back in 2005, actually. And here's an artist's conception of what that probe looked like coming down through the atmosphere, getting slowed down by a parachute and gently landing on the surface. And it survived on the surface for some time, radioing back to the Cassini spacecraft that was flying overhead. All of its data that it took as it came down through the atmosphere, learning about the atmospheric conditions, the temperature, the wind speeds, composition, taking pictures. And what's interesting is that this probe was designed to be able to survive and land in either liquid or solid, because Titan was actually predicted in some models to have a global ocean covering its surface. Now, it's cold out there, right? Titan and Saturn are some 9 or 10 times as far from the sun as the Earth is. It's very cold out there. And so there's a lot of water, but it's all frozen. So the predicted ocean wouldn't have been water, it would have been methane and ethane, which are hydrocarbons that are actually liquid at those cold temperatures. Well, it turns out that the Huygens probe landed on solid surface, although we have indications that it was a little bit damp when it landed, so perhaps it had recently rained. And this is what it looked like on the surface when it took kind of a final image. Everything's kind of orangey looking, right? And this is the result of all that hydrocarbon chemistry that happens. And you can see these little rocks on the surface. They're a few centimeters across. They're probably like this big. And they're almost certainly made of water ice. And I love this image because these stones that you see, these water ice stones, look to me a lot like almost a riverbed on Earth, right? They're kind of soft looking, like they've been eroded a little bit. They're not really rough looking. And so we think that a lot of what's happening on Titan is a lot of fluid flow. There's the thick atmosphere. We know that there's fluids on the surface and wind and rain. So it's a very Earth-like place. I mentioned it's cold. It's about 290 degrees Fahrenheit. So you might think about, well, what are humans going to do in minus 290 degrees Fahrenheit? I think humans can adapt to cold pretty easily. We're a warm suit. You know, it's got that thick atmosphere, so at least they wouldn't need to be wearing a pressure suit. So there's kind of pros and cons. And also, because it does have that thick atmosphere, there's not a lot of like day-night temperature variations. It's kind of an insulating atmosphere, and so no matter where you go on the surface, the temperature is kind of the same. It's a very Earth-like place, as I mentioned. These are even dunes. So we know that there's hydrocarbon dunes that are a lot like sand dunes on Earth. They are on roughly the same scale, so there must be enough wind to create these hydrocarbon dunes on Titan, almost like on Earth, and just a lot of Earth-like kind of qualities. Here's another image of Titan showing clouds in the atmosphere. We see the clouds appear seasonally, and we also see evidence of rain. And even though there is not a global ocean on Titan, there are lakes on the surface. So Titan is really special. It's the only place in the solar system, other than the Earth, that has stable surface liquids. Again, these are lakes at the North Pole. This is a radar map of a polar projection of the radar of the North Pole, and the dark areas there are lakes. And we knew from the radar images that they looked a lot like lakes on Earth, these sort of irregular-looking shorelines and so forth, and we could tell that they were smoother than the surrounding terrains. But we also confirmed that they were liquid by actually seeing the glint of sunlight off of them, which you can really only do from a liquid surface. So these are lakes. They're named after lakes here on Earth. For instance, you might be interested, or you might be familiar with Lake Cayuga in upstate New York. There's a Cayuga locus on Titan. And there are larger seas called Mari, just like on the moon, that are named after mythological sea creatures, like Kraken Mari. So here's some more pictures. This is Ligeia Mari, just to kind of demonstrate really how Earth-like they look. Here's Kraken Mari. Here's part of the shoreline of Kraken Mari. Now, back to sort of reality. We've been thinking about sending humans back to the moon and onward to Mars for some decades. And frustratingly, it hasn't happened yet, right? So these are headlines from 1989, 1969. Again, kind of making the same predictions for some 50 years now. What has happened? We probably should have been able to make it to Mars decades ago. Building rockets is pretty straightforward, and it's actually getting cheaper thanks to the commercial outfits like SpaceX and so forth, and commercial innovation that's happening. But one of the big risks that I've mentioned is radiation. And so this is kind of a complicated chart from the Human Research Program at JSC, Johnson Space Center, thinking about human health. And it shows the health risks of a Mars trip. And so in all the different rows of the different health risks, and where it's red, we've really got to work on those things and make them turn green, which means that they're addressed. The red things mean high likelihood and high consequence, and the yellow is kind of mid likelihood and mid consequence. And so we really need to work on technological advances in these areas to turn all these red areas green. Now, one of these red areas is, this is a detail of it, it's about space radiation and how damaging it is to the central nervous system. We know that radiation causes cancer. More recently, lab work has actually demonstrated that it can cause brain damage. And so that presents a real mission risk. And so we need to overcome that problem. We need to develop radiation shielding that's successful, and we also need to think about our destination in the solar system. The main kind of damaging radiation that we're really talking about is galactic cosmic rays, more so than solar radiation, which is a little bit more controllable, or we can handle it a little bit more. These are particles that come from exploding stars, and they're very powerful. Now, I mentioned water as a potential shield, and I showed you that drawing of a habitat on Mars that used water for the walls. It takes about 2 meters of water to block about half of the galactic cosmic rays coming in. And a cubic meter of water weighs more than a ton, so it's really impractical to launch those kind of materials off of the surface of the Earth. Although people have talked about, water shielding, swimming pools on spacecraft to help astronauts shield from, for instance, solar storms while they're en route to a destination. So I am optimistic that these problems can be solved by faster spacecraft. Faster spacecraft will shorten trip time and decrease the amount of radiation exposure that astronauts experience, decreasing risk. And also cheaper launch capabilities. But we're not quite there yet. The commercial space companies are really accelerating the pace of development, which is terrific. And I won't read it now, but we did visit SpaceX as research for part of our book and looked at what they're doing and found the environment to be very stimulating. A lot of young people, a lot of innovation there. And I feel like the commercial partnerships with NASA and the other space agencies are really going to help move us forward. But we need faster propulsion, right? We need to be able to get to places in the solar system faster. To go to Titan, we'd really need a leap in propulsion. We cannot use chemical propulsion. It took Cassini 7 years to get to Titan using chemical propulsion. So that's not really doable in terms of sending humans anywhere. But we've interviewed Dr. Sonny White at Johnson Space Center, and he's working on some really advanced ideas, including a thruster that uses quantum virtual particles as propellant. So it's kind of like an ion thruster, but using quantum particles as the propellant. And he's even developed an idea for a warp drive, like in Star Trek, for when we go to other solar systems. So this is kind of some of his work that he's working on. Don't ask me about this. This is not my stuff. But the basic idea is that there's a bunch of exotic matter out there, and it would form a ring around the spacecraft, and it would create a bubble in the space-time that would allow the craft to kind of leapfrog through space. Space would stretch, and so the spacecraft doesn't have to travel any faster than the speed of light. So a lot of people have their doubts about this. Some people think it will work, some people don't. But I think it's really exciting and inspiring that NASA is funding this kind of crazy work. It's crazy, but that we got to get crazy if we're going to really send humans out there, right? Especially if we're talking about going to Titan or maybe even going to exoplanets, planets orbiting other stars. So, back to Titan. This is an artist's conception of a rainstorm on Titan and flowing rivers. How would a settlement on Titan really work? Well, this has to do with kind of the orangey appearance of it. I mentioned hydrocarbon chemistry in the atmosphere. There's a little methane in the atmosphere, maybe 1% or 2%. And when solar photons and also electrons from the magnetosphere of Saturn interact with the carbon and the nitrogen in the atmosphere, they make more complex organic molecules. And as they get more complex, they get larger and heavier, and they end up settling down to the surface. And they make the atmosphere very hazy. That's why we can't see through it. It's like literally smog, like a smoggy day in LA, but kind of all the time. That being said, even though it's a pretty dense atmosphere and it's hazy, you can still see the sun. It's not completely dark by any means. It's kind of about the brightness of just post-sunset all the time. And you can see Saturn if you're on the right side of Titan, because just like our moon, Titan has one side facing Saturn all the time. If you live on that side of Titan, you'd have an awesome view of Saturn all the time. Anyway, so there's a lot of hydrocarbons all over the surface. Here's an example of a beautiful image, actually, of the haze layer in Titan's atmosphere. So there's tons of hydrocarbons. Ligeia Mare has some 40 times the oil reserves here on Earth. So if you wanted to do combustion of hydrocarbons to make energy, you could do that on Titan. It's a little bit complicated because then you'd have to access the water ice, melt the ice, do electrolysis. I think I've got, let me come back to that. You do electrolysis, just like on the International Space Station, to get the oxygen to do the combustion. Because I mentioned Titan's atmosphere has a lot of nitrogen and some methane and some trace species, but it doesn't have any oxygen. So for astronauts and settlers on Titan to breathe, they'd need to make the oxygen and bring it into their hab. Again, we know how to do a lot of that stuff from ISS. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of water on Titan. It is an icy moon. This is kind of a cutaway model cartoon of what the interior probably looks like. It probably has a rocky core, and then it has an ice layer, and it probably actually we have a pretty good indication that Titan itself is an ocean world, like Europa and Enceladus that I mentioned. It has a subsurface liquid ocean. And then it's got ice on top of that, and then kind of hydrocarbon, the orangey hydrocarbons covering that. So there's lots of ice to access on Titan. Lots of resources. Hydrocarbons, ice. And so you can imagine that you can make a power plant on Titan. You can take in methane from the lakes, and you can take in water from the surroundings, and you can make energy and breathable oxygen. And there's other forms of energy too. You can imagine wind energy, tidal energy, even solar energy is doable, just so long as you have enough square footage of solar panels. So this, to me, is a potentially self-sustaining environment. What about transportation? It's got an atmosphere, so you can fly. This is a concept for a mission that was proposed. This is a uncrewed kind of drone that would go around Titan in the atmosphere and make scientific measurements. What is really cool is that we now have another mission going to Titan. It's called the Dragonfly mission. It was recently selected by NASA, and it is going to fly around through the atmosphere. It's like a drone or a quadcopter. So it's going to come in on a parachute, land, fly out of its aeroshell, and then land, take measurements, fly to the next spot, take some more measurements, and it's going to tell us all about Titan. and how habitable it might be, because we know that there's a lot of organics there, and maybe even parts of the surface that could have liquid water. And again, because you've got that nice dense atmosphere, low gravity, you don't even need an airplane if you want to fly there. Because you can imagine you're just kind of bouncing around because of the low gravity, and all you have to do is flap your arms against the dense atmosphere, and you can just fly under your own power. That, to me, is a really awesome reason to go to Titan on its own. Just because you can fly. If you get lazy, then you could maybe strap a little rocket motor on your back and buzz around. You can also sail around, boat around, take a submarine around the lakes. This is, again, an artist's conception of another mission idea for a submarine that was proposed to go into Titan's lakes and learn about their lakes and, again, how habitable they might be. Could there be any little critters living in those lakes, and what would they look like? So you could really use any kind of boat that you wanted. You could use a sailboat, powerboat. Lots of options for Titan. And so I'm going to just do a little brief reading to close. And this is a passage from the book that motivates our thinking about kind of the whole concept. The trends of environmental and political conditions on Earth are as important a part of a scenario for space colonization as the technology story, and an important part of understanding ourselves. Along with learning how our bodies respond to space, we need to predict how our societies will respond to a deteriorating environment, increasing political and religious conflict, and widening wealth disparities. The inspiring and discouraging qualities that make people such interesting animals are already mixing to create the movement towards space. Billionaires are building spaceships to go farther than any man or woman has gone before. At the same time, they make money selling tickets for joyrides beyond the atmosphere. So as we wrote this book, we met brilliant young engineers at commercial space companies who are driving down the cost of access to space. They're putting in long hours to make spaceflight a part of everyday life and thinking several steps beyond. And they don't work so hard just for a paycheck. These young aerospace workers speak the language of Star Trek, attacking huge technical challenges with the dexterity and attitude of hackers. They're unfamiliar with failure and utterly sure they are on the way to space. Spending time with these young people, it's not hard to imagine a day when a huge spaceship will prepare for departure from the end of a long retractable corridor connected to a commercial space station orbiting the Earth. That scenario may sound like science fiction, but doesn't the future often sound like science fiction until it suddenly arrives? Thank you so much for your interest, and I'd be happy to take any questions.